that information because before every grant agreement, because there may have been a change at the institution. For instance, you may have a new fiscal individual that is responsible for this particular appropriation. Or you may have a new official representative other than the president or the chancellor that is the designee for this particular appropriation. So we will always send a signature authorization form prior to issuing the grant agreement. The next article, which is Article 4, does speak to the reversion date and the deadline to expend the funds. This is something that is extremely important because, as Ashley noted and as Wesley noted, there are reversion dates to these funds, and there are expenditure timelines with the 5% with the 5%, 85% rule. So on the next page, it talks a little bit about the early termination before reversion date. Now, the early termination is really something that just happens as a result of the funding being clawed back. For instance, I think this happened a few years ago with some project funds. Typically, that won't happen unless an institution doesn't have those funds encumbered. If you have an encumbrance, the funding for the most part won't be clawed back. But it's also in case there's any violations of the terms of the agreement, such as not expending the funding, as called out for, or there's other instances as well, which again we've just never, we've never really had to use this this particular section. Of course, they do speak to fraud, waste, and abuse. There are times whenever an expenditure may happen that is not allowable. One of the things that we will do is we will just ask that the institution reimburse the agency for that expenditure, which in essence just frees the money up in order for the institution to use it again on an appropriate expenditure. And then, of course, we also have the suspension of new or further obligations. So this particular section, provides the department the opportunity to suspend entering into notice of obligations. Again, typically this is if funding becomes frozen, then of course we need to suspend any further notice of obligations. And then, of course, there's a corrective action plan in the event of a suspension section in the grant agreement as well. And then, of course, as you go into Article 7, it talks about, amendments to this particular grant agreement. And of course, it talks about the fact that it shall not be altered, changed, or amended. I think as Wesley was discussing in his presentation, one of the things that DFA is wanting to do, and we will be a part of that, is looking at how the grant agreement might be updated or streamlined. And then, of course, you'll reporting. Now, one of the things I want to bring up on reporting, and we'll talk about it in more detail when we get to the reporting section, but the database reporting is speaking to the CPMS updates. And that's really what the database reporting is about. One of the things that you will find is that the previous grant agreements, for those of you that have been here for a while, did have a section that required the submittal of a paper periodic report. That was removed. And so there are still some grant agreements that are out there that were issued for older appropriations that still have that paper periodic report requirement. But for the newer grant agreements, which is anything after 2018, those grant agreements do not require a paper periodic report, just the database reporting. There also is a request for payment procedures and deadlines section in the grant agreement. As we talk about draw requests, we'll go into this with a little bit more detail, as well as the deadlines. And then we also have a project conditions and restrictions section in the grant agreement that really just covers state law and procurement requirements. And in essence, what it talks about is, funding expended in accordance with state law. It talks about project being implemented with New Mexico Public Works Minimum Works Act. It talks about the anti-donation clause in section A3, which is project may only benefit private entities in accordance with applicable law. And then, of course, it also talks about the grantee shall not for a period of 10 years from the date of this agreement convert any property acquired with the project's funds to use other than specified in the project description without written approval. And then, of course, it talks about federal laws. So again, this is really a section that every institution, as they're doing their work, as they're procuring these projects, as they are procuring their contractors, as they're procuring their goods and services, if you're following the procurement code, if you're following the state laws related to that particular procurement, then this section is really what ties to that. So we typically, and you all will know, those of you that have worked in higher ed for some time with the higher education department, will know that this is something that that we take your words on, because we know that the institutions are following these requirements. But it's listed in the grant agreement nonetheless. Of course, there's also the strict accountability of receipts and disbursements, which just talks about records retention. And then also it talks about improperly reimbursed funds. And this is what I was talking about earlier, where the department may request that you, send the money back to the department. So that way it can be, rebudgeted back to the project for use. So the good thing is you don't lose it. You'll be able to use it on an allowable expenditure. And then, of course, liability, scope of the agreement, and then two of probably the most important items that that we'll talk about more in the notice of obligation, but it really is the two articles on the required non-appropriations clause and the required termination clause. These particular clauses are required in the agreements that institutions enter into with their third-party vendors. Those contracts must have these two non-appropriations and termination clauses added. And this isn't just for higher ed. Again, this is for all entities receiving capital outlay funding through a grant agreement. And we'll go into more detail, as I mentioned, when we get to that section. The other area is the compliance with uniform funding criteria. I think that Wesley spoke about the Executive Order 2016-003, and Executive Order 2016-003 is the executive order that requires the establishment of a grant agreement process. It requires the establishment of rules and regulations for that grant agreement process by DFA, and it requires a uniform funding criteria verification of all entities prior to them receiving state funds. Our institutional finance division, with the help of our auditor, Mr. Scott Eccles, who many of you may know, he's the one that actually does the uniform funding criteria reviews for me prior to issuing a grant agreement for a project. And what that uniform funding criteria review is it's a review of your annual audit to ensure that you have a current audit and also to ensure that any findings have been addressed. And as I mentioned earlier, depending on the results of the uniform funding criteria, the agency will make a determination on, number one, whether or not the funding should in fact be issued. Number two, if the funding is to be issued, but there are items in the audit that are of concern, that we can issue additional items or additional criteria on top of the already existing grant agreement process and requirements. And that also speaks to the EFOP that I was speaking about earlier. And of course, the third thing is being able to issue the funding without any restrictions at all. The other article in the grant agreement that is only used if the appropriation is being funded by severance tax or general obligation bonds is this particular clause here. And in essence, this is the clause that Ashley was talking about before, and Wesley as well, which speaks to the 5% funds within 6 months of bond issuance, as certified by the bond questionnaire. And so again, like I say, this is the section of the grant agreement that speaks specifically to that questionnaire as well. This is just the signature area of the page. You know, for those of you who have already received grant agreements this year for severance tax, or last year, should I say, for severance tax, these grant agreements are issued electronically. We issue them through DocuSign, and the sections and the areas where your president or your designee signs off on are already pre-populated and are ready for signature through the DocuSign process. And then, of course, in the departments section, you know, that is our cabinet secretary. And then as far as the grant agreement goes, there's also some exhibits or attachments to the grant agreement. Many of you will recognize this first one, which is the notice of obligation to reimburse. We'll go into that in more detail here shortly. And the other item, which I thought I had in my PowerPoint, but I don't, is the other item that's also an exhibit in the grant agreement is the Higher Education Department's draw request and certification form. So those are the items that are attached to the grant agreement exhibits. So I'll go ahead and just pause here before moving on to see if anybody has any questions. I'll go ahead and look in the chat. And so there's one question is, can I have a copy of the agreement for reference? And yes, the grant agreements are actually available on the DFA website. What we can do is we'll go ahead and add a link to the chat that'll take you directly to the grant agreement that is the same one that I used in this presentation, which is not populated, but just highlighted with the areas for your use. The other item, okay, Wesley just posted that link to the DFA website. So if there's no other questions, I will go ahead and move on to the next section, which is notice of obligations. Now, I think we talked earlier about notice of obligations in the grant agreement, but the other thing that I want to make note of is that the Higher Education Department just recently created a notice of obligation procedures. This procedure was created just a couple of months ago, and it was long time overdue. We definitely needed to have a procedure put in place. And so I really do want to thank the institutions that assisted with this procedure. I did reach out to several institutions asking for their input on the procedure to make sure that what the procedure, how the procedure was written made sense, and to make sure that there was nothing that that was being requested that that may cause issue at the institution level. And based on the comments that I received from the institutions, there were some tweaks made, and this ultimately is the procedure that was rolled out. This procedure is posted on the Higher Education Department website, and we'll put there is a link to that on the slide presentation, and then we'll also post that link to the chat. But on the notice of obligation procedures, I really wanted to make sure that I covered and provided guidance on all of the different procurement methodologies that an institution will use when requesting a grant agreement. So you'll notice on the first three items, there are some requirements that need to be in place before you can even start the process of requesting an NOO. And the first is you must have a fully executed grant agreement between the Higher Education Department and your HEI. Again, this is not for constitutional schools. This is specifically for community colleges and tribal schools. The second here makes note that the NOO must be prepared and submitted in accordance with the limitation on department's obligation to make grant disbursements to grantee of the executed grant agreement. And we'll look at that in more detail here shortly. It also notes on here that we must receive the completed notice of obligation form that includes the name of each vendor, total amount of third-party agreement, and the total amount of encumbrance being requested. An HEI may encumber funds from multiple vendors. However, the HED will only encumber up to the appropriation amount. Any additional costs will be the responsibility of the HEI. And then, of course, these sections outline each of the different procurement types that an institution may have and what the agency is requiring to be submitted as part of each of these particular types of procurements. So if you have an RFP or an invitation for bids, we need a copy of the contract as soon as possible after execution by the third party, but prior to execution by the HEI. This is an important point because if there are changes that we need made, it's easier to make them before the contract is executed. But we definitely need the third party, the contractor or vendor, to have signed it because that's what is called out for in the grant agreement. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that the third party has already approved what's in the contract, which includes the articles, the required non-appropriations clause and required termination clause, which you'll see on the bullet points here. But we want to make sure that that particular contract references the project appropriation number or the appropriation description. We need the detailed statement of work to be included. We need the contract amount. We need the contract completion date. And then we need the required non-appropriations clause and required termination clause. For a request for quote, using an SPA, GSA, or CES contract, we need the construction services agreement. We need reference to the project appropriation number. We need the detailed scope of work. We need the contract amount. We need the contract completion date, and we need the non-appropriations and termination clauses. That's the information that we need for those RFQs. If you're purchasing equipment or materials only, and a contract is not required, then we need the cost proposal or the quote. The cost proposals or quotes must at a minimum include a reference to the project appropriation number, the valid period of the cost proposal or quote, a detailed statement of work, itemized description of deliverables and the cost, shipping, freight, delivery costs, if applicable, and the GRT amount if not included in the proposal or quote. So those are the three items or the three procurement vehicles that we recognize and the information that's needed when you're submitting either of those documents or either of those requests for a notice of obligation. Now, we also understand that there are modification requests with the notice of obligation, and those notice of obligation requests may be to to reduce the amount that's been encumbered because the price ended up being lower, or it may be that an institution has decided that they want to add additional costs that weren't originally included. And so, so these items such as change orders, would need to be submitted as a modification request. And so what we ask for is we ask for the copy of the change order, again, as soon as possible after execution by the third party, but prior to execution by the HEI. And then the change order request must at a minimum include the reference to the project appropriation, a detailed description of the change, and the change order amount. Now, for non-change order modifications, such as I mentioned before, just reducing the encumbrance, we just need a justification from the HEI, on why the change is being requested. And we've had several of these in the past. Really, all we're looking for is just the justification, so that way we have it in our files as to why that amount of funding was disencumbered. Now, when we talk about encumbrance and disencumbrance, one of the things that I think is important to note is that when you request a notice of obligation from the Higher Education Department, and we approve that notice of obligation, we actually encumber the funds from your appropriation for that notice of obligation. And that's important because when you don't have any notice of obligation submitted, regardless of what you have encumbered at your institution, DFA does not recognize that encumbrance because it is not encumbered at the agency level. And I want to stress that because there are times when funding is short that the legislature claws back unspent funds, And one of the key factors that they look for is whether or not the funds have been encumbered, whether there's any valid encumbrances. And the agency encumbrance is the only encumbrance that they verify. And so I think so I wanted to just clarify and make that point. So when you submit your NOO requests with the required supporting documentation, you send it over to me via email. Once I receive that information, I'll review it. And if there are no issues with the notice of obligation, then you'll receive the signed notice of obligation. If there are questions or comments or issues that are noted, then of course I'll respond in an email letting you know what those issues are. Some of you may have noted or noticed that my responses lately have referred you back to the procedure. And that's really because, what I'm wanting to do is just make sure that everybody is aware of the procedure. And then number two, it really does give you exactly what's necessary in the procedures, so it'll help you to put your documentation together. Once you receive your signed NOO, then you are able to execute the third-party agreement, create your purchase order, and proceed with the project or proceed with the purchase. And then lastly, we're asking that you provide a copy of the executed third-party agreement and purchase order to the NMHED. So that's one of the things that is new, and so I wanted to just emphasize that. We do want to see the executed third-party agreement and purchase order. And so, so once that is all done, you can just send it to me via email as well. That's the point in time. Let me take that back. So once we send you the signed NOO, that's the point in time when we will encumber the funds on our end. And Loretta is the one who who takes care of that, and she'll create a purchase order if it's the first NOO, or she'll increase the encumbrance on that purchase order for any additional notice of obligations that are approved after the first one. And then the last important note that I just want to bring up is that we will only reimburse expenditures related to the statement of work or itemized description of materials that supported the issuance of the signed NOO. So I just want to make sure that that everybody is made aware of that. I think everybody that has been doing notice of obligations understands that. But for individuals who are new to the NOO process, that is what we use as our gauge. That's our baseline for how we reimburse on the draw requests. So now let's go over the NOO form. So you'll see that on the top, the department representative, that would be the department representative in the grant agreement, which is typically the capital projects director. That's me or whoever that individual may be. And then the grantee is the name of the institution. And then the grantee official representative is the name of the individual that was submitted to the to the agency on the signature authorization form, and that's included in the signature or in the grantee section of the form of the grant agreement. The grant number, that is the appropriation number, and the grant termination date, of course, is the reversion date. So as you go down, you'll see a section for grant agreement number. That is the appropriation number again. And then you'll see vendor or contractor, and you'll notice that there's 3 sections for that. The notice of obligation was updated at the time that the grant agreement was updated in order to allow for additional vendors to be submitted at the same time under one notice of obligation. So what we're asking is that you enter the name of the vendor or the contractor on the first line. And then on the second line, we ask that you enter the third-party obligation amount. Now, what's important here is that you will have contracts, many of you at times, that the contract amount or the third-party obligation amount is $2 million, the total contract amount. But you're only wanting to reimburse $500,000 from this particular appropriation. So what we're asking that you do in the third-party obligation amount section is list the third-party obligation amount, which is the total amount of the contract, and then write in the total amount that you want obligated, from the particular appropriation. We are working to see if as part of the next updates, we can get that update added to the notice of obligation form. Hopefully that can be something that we can do. So that way you'll have a separate line in order to distinguish the two. But the reason why that's important is because if you have multiple vendors and you have multiple dollar amounts for contracts, we don't know how much you're wanting to obligate per vendor if you have more than one. And so that's why we're asking you to break out the total amount of the contract and then how much you want obligated in this notice of obligation request. As you go down, you'll notice the grant amount minus AIPP. As we mentioned earlier in the presentation, AIPP is not something that should be budgeted because it is not funding that you receive. That's taken off the top. So you want the grant amount minus AIPP entered here. And then you want the amount of the notice of obligation entered in the second line. This is where I say it's difficult if you just enter the third-party obligation amount on your vendors up top. Because if you have a third-party obligation amount of 2 million and then the next one is 1 million, and then you note that you want to only encumber 500,000, I don't know how much of that 500,000 is for vendor 1 or vendor 2. So that's, again, this really leads to why we want that breakout. The total amount of all previously issued notice of obligations. So this is the amount that you will put. The amount that you will put in here is 0 for the first notice of obligation request. For the second notice of obligation request that you submit, here's where you'll just carry over how much you requested obligation for. And then, of course, the total amount of notice of obligation to date is just adding, the previous 2 cells. And then, of course, the department rep approver. So this section at the bottom is for the higher education department. It's not necessary for you to fill this section out. I'll fill it out with my name, title, I'll sign it and date it and send it back to you. So that's a quick overview of the notice of obligation to request form. Now, I wanted to go ahead and just talk a little bit about the grant agreement and how that plays into the notice of obligation form as well. And the procedures that were created by the agency. And so In this section here, it really is just an overview, of our limitation on obligating the funds for the project. The important point that I want to make known here is that upon the effective date of this agreement, the grantee shall only be reimbursed for monies for which the department has issued and the grantee has received a notice of department's obligation to reimburse. So that ties back into, you really can't send a notice of obligation until you have a grant agreement in place. That's where that section comes from in our policy, okay? The total amount received by the grantee shall not exceed, of course, the adjusted appropriation amount. And when it says adjusted, that just means the amount that's adjusted after AIPP. And of course, the total of all amounts stated in the notice of obligation. So it's covering itself in two ways. So you don't have more money to spend than what you've been appropriated, and you don't have more money to be reimbursed than what's been approved by a notice of obligation. That's really what that is saying, And then, of course, it does speak again to the requirements, that you're following state procurement code and binding written obligations and purchase orders. And then, of course, it also has a section here related to timely request for payment in accordance with the other procedures in the grant. Okay. And then it also talks about the submission of documentation of all third-party obligations to the department and the department's issuance and the grantee's receiving of. And then here is what outlines that section. Okay. So really what it's saying is this is what is necessary in order for you all to submit in order for us to be able to acknowledge or accept the notice of obligation. One copy of all third-party obligations as soon as possible after execution by the third party, but prior to execution by the grantee. You'll see that this is all, this all ties into the procedure that was created. That the grantee acknowledges and agrees that if you do enter into a third-party obligation before receiving a notice of obligation, it is really the institution's responsibility to pay for that expenditure. And I think that one of the things that we've talked about even in previous trainings is that the higher education department, when we first started issuing grant agreements, was being more lenient because it was a new process in regards to reimbursing for after the fact requests. However, that is not something that we can do anymore. So that's where this section plays in here. It's solely the responsibility of the institution. This one right here, the department may, in its sole and absolute discretion, issue to grantee a notice of obligation for a particular amount of that third party. And so I think what that means is that back to what I was talking about on the notice of obligation form, you may have a $2 million contract, but you only want $500,000 to be encumbered under a particular appropriation, or you may even have multiple appropriations where you want to split that encumbrance amongst several of them. This just talks about that we may do that. And also the date the department signs the notice of obligation is the date that the notice of obligation is effective. And again, that's important because, again, that's when we encumber those funds. And so, payment for any work performed or goods received prior to the effective date is wholly and solely the obligation of the grantee. Again, back to that point on, the institutions are responsible. And so the next item that we'll talk about is the required non-appropriations clauses. And I know that there are already standardized non-appropriations clauses and early termination clauses in contracts. But what the department is requiring is that this particular clause, as specifically written, starting with the terms of this agreement are, need to be taken verbatim and entered into your contracts. And in essence, all this does is, for this particular one, the non-appropriations, is really, it just informs that if sufficient appropriations and authorization are not made by the legislature, that the institution may immediately terminate the agreement by giving the contractor written notice of the termination. And again, I know that you all have those types of termination clauses already, standard termination clauses. However, we are asking that this particular one be specifically entered into your agreements, into your contracts. And so I think that the majority of institutions are doing this. But I just wanted to highlight it. And then the next item is the termination clause. Again, same point. I know you all have a termination clause. However, this one specifically, speaks to the department being able to early terminate the grant agreement, and that the entity or the agency, institution, may also early terminate the contract by providing them written notice. And of course, speaking specifically, to the institution's only liability to pay the contractor for accepted goods, right? Acceptable goods delivered and services rendered. So that concludes the, the discussion on the notice of obligation process. So I'll go ahead and pause here to see if anybody has any questions. So in looking at the chat, I thank you, Loretta, for making that note. We also do have the grant agreement template on our website as well, and we'll be noting that link here shortly. And then there's another question of whether or not these slides will be printable for reference, and so the answer is yes. This entire presentation is going to be made available, the recorded format, as well as each individual slide deck will be placed on our website, so you can go back and print out any of the presentation or specific slides that you would like. The last question that I have in the chat box is, at the conclusion of the presentation today, I will post the slide deck. The recording itself is something that needs to be done by our PIO because it needs to be converted, and so hopefully the actual presentation in video format will be available by tomorrow. But I will send an email to all the participants letting them know when it's posted. If there's no other questions, I'll go ahead and go on to the next section, which is the CPMS and paper periodic reporting. Now, I did leave paper periodic reporting in here only because there are still some grant agreements, as I mentioned before, that still have the requirement for paper. Those grant agreements are few and far between, and hopefully soon we will be at the point to where we'll just be doing the CPMS reporting. So to start out, one of the things that I wanted to go ahead and make note of is doing a little bit of clarification on the CPMS reporting and the dates that are required. So this came directly out of the Department of Finance's Capital Outlay Bureau reporting requirements process, and I did put a link on here, but I'm not sure if the link will work because this is an older slide, and I know that DFA does have their own did update their website, so this particular link may not work. However, the information that's in this slide is still accurate. So for CPMS reporting, local entities are required to update active capital outlay appropriations on a monthly basis. And what's important about that is that the updates must be done by the 30th of each month. Now, the way we look at it is by the last day of the month, and the reason why is because some days have 31 days, some days have 28, and so we look at it as the last day of the month. State agencies are required to update active capital outlay appropriations on a quarterly basis, and those are done by the 15th of March, June, September, and December. In order to do these updates, you will need a username and a password. And so I think that every institution here already has, the access necessary in order to make these updates. But if you don't, on Wesley's slide deck, he did have the contact information for his office. And you can reach out to Sarah De La Rosa, and she would be more than happy to assist with that. And then you're also welcome to reach out to me, and we can definitely put you in touch. But the clarification that I want to make note of is that a local entity is the community colleges and tribal institutions. And so what that means is that community colleges and tribal institutions are required to update CPMS on a monthly basis. And I really want to stress this because I know there are times that when I go in on a quarterly basis, there are times where there are no updates for a couple of months on some institutions. And so I don't review these on a monthly basis. However, I will say that the DFA and LFC, specifically DFA, can run reports and do run reports on this quite often in order to update their Tableau database, which is the forward-facing database to the public, which if any individual in the public wants to look at a particular appropriation, the data that they pull up is only as good as what the last CPMS update is. And so if you wait a couple of months in order to do the updates, you may miss out on either draw requests that you've submitted, or you may also miss out on notice of obligations that you potentially have encumbered, or other key points in your project that speak to the progress that's taking place. And so like I say, local entities, monthly basis, that's community colleges and tribal institutions. State agencies are the higher education department, for instances. Research universities, comprehensive universities, and independent community colleges. Those are considered the state agencies, and those particular entities report on a quarterly basis. So if there's any questions on that, by all means, let me know. So now let's talk a little bit about the grant agreement and how the grant agreement speaks to those particular requirements. If you are a community college or a tribal college, your appropriation will come through the higher education department through a grant agreement. And Article 8, which is the reports, speaks to the database reporting. And it specifically notes that the grantee shall report monthly project activity by entering such project information as the department and Department of Finance may require into a database maintained by the Department of Finance and Administration, which is the CPMS database. And then additionally, the grantee shall certify on the request for payment form that updates have been maintained and are current in the database. The grantee hereby acknowledges that failure to perform and/or certify updates into the database will delay or potentially jeopardize the reimbursement of funds. And so the reason why I wanted to kind of read that is because many of you will notice that we updated our draw request procedures as well. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. But our draw request procedures now require a printout of the most recent CPMS update, and that be submitted as part of the draw request. This is why, because the grant agreement requires that it be certified, right? That it be certified that the updates have been made into the database. And so again, that's the reason for this particular change to the draw request procedures. Now here in the grant agreement itself, it does say monthly reports shall be due on the last day of each month. And the important point is beginning with the first full month following execution of the agreement by the department and ending upon the submission of the final request for reimbursement. So there's your start point and your stop point. And so that to me is what's really important when determining when you need to start submitting. So if we issue you a grant agreement on March the 13th, and your president signs off on it on March the 18th, and our cabinet secretary signs off on it on March the 20th, then you don't have to start reporting in CPMS until the following month, the first full month following the execution of the agreement. So that would mean that you wouldn't start reporting until April, the last day in April. Now the agency will be updating CPMS prior to that. And the reason for that is because we need to show that the funding has been appropriated, and then we need to show that the grant agreement has been issued to an institution, and then we have to show that the grant agreement has been executed. And these are all important points because Tableau tracks all of that. And DFA can pull a report and show that funding was appropriated at this particular point in time, funding was budgeted at this appropriate point of time, yet grant agreements haven't been issued, which means we're delaying, or there's a delay in the ability for the institution to start drawing down those funds. And the whole intent here is get the money out there where it can be spent. And so that's one of the reasons why, we emphasize making sure that you start reporting 1 month following the execution of the grant agreement. So this is what CPMS looks like. And I just pulled an example that it's an old example, but I'm using it because nothing has changed in how CPMS looks. So the capital appropriations search This is the CPMS website that you will go to. When you open that website up, this is what you're going to see. Now, up on the top right-hand corner, you're going to have a login screen. So this right here is the forward-facing website that anybody can log it, that anybody can view. So if anybody is interested in looking at any appropriation, all they need to do is go in here. They can do the drop down for the agency. They can pull up New Mexico State University, the University of New Mexico. They can pull up Higher Education Department and click submit, and all the projects are going to come up. I think everybody is aware of that. In order to update CPMS, you have to have a login. And so what you'll do is you'll click on the login up on the upper top right-hand corner of the website, as you see login. And when you do that, you're going to open up the CPMS page. Actually, I take that back. You're going to pull up your projects, and it'll only be your specific projects that you can view. From that point, then you choose a project, and you can go ahead and start updating the information. What you'll notice is on the state agency data, well, you'll notice there's different sections. So you'll notice the top of the form, you know, has the year, the appropriation title, the fund code, all that good stuff. That's all pre-populated. Then you'll see the share Board of Finance data. This is where the Board of Finance goes in and they provide their updates on how much of the funding has been expended in share, what the balance is in share, you know, and then what they've expended on their end. And of course, you know, it also has the AIPP amount, reversion amount, all that good stuff. Then you'll see the state agency data. For the state agency data, this is the section that universities, you know, and comprehensives are going to populate, as well as the higher education department. This is the section that'll be populated quarterly. You'll notice there's a local fiscal agent code that's already populated for you. The reauthorized from prior project amount, you don't do anything there. The amount obligated, that's the amount that you're going to show as a four-year institution. That's the amount that you're going to show that you have encumbered for the project. The project end date, this can go one of two ways. We typically use the reversion date, and we plug the reversion date into the project end date. But you can also plug in the end date as called out for in your contract, if that's something that you would like to do. The expended amount, that's the amount of money that you have actually paid out. And then, of course, the AIPP amount is going to be automatically populated. The reauthorized to new project, don't have to worry about that. And then, of course, the reversion amount, don't have to worry about that. And then here's where we get into the real meat and potatoes, and I really want to concentrate on this, because this is the area that is important. So I'm going to go to the next page because I want to kind of highlight it and open it up a little bit more here. But you'll notice on the project status, this section is, again, under the state agency data. This is where the higher education department provides their quarterly update. And so for universities and comprehensives, four-year institutions, this is the area that they want to populate as well, as I mentioned before. On the project status, you know, you really want to let everybody know what the status is of your project, right? Where is it currently at? You know, that's the information that you want to enter here. The next section, which is the goal or the milestone achieved last quarter, this is where you want to really talk about what has been accomplished over the past quarter. Did you, for this particular example, right? I mean, what we did is as an agency, we took information from the higher ed institution, and we noted that last quarter, right, they selected the contractor and it was approved by their board. We also noted on here that the project was approved by the higher education department during the last quarter, and we note the date of that approval. For colleges, universities, this is something that is important that you should also note is, when the project came forward and was approved by higher ed, as well as State Board of Finance. And then, of course, for us, we just note that the monthly PPR and CPMS updates, have been completed per the grant agreement. And then we note if there was any draws submitted, which draw numbers they were. And so that's the information that we enter. But of course, for the institution, you have a lot more to offer in this particular section. Again, I'm talking to the comprehensives and research institutions. And then, of course, the goal and the milestone for next quarter, for us, we just talked about, submittal of a notice of obligation, starting construction on the project, and then continuing the reporting. But for the institution, there's, again, a lot more data that can be entered into this section that I think is important of what your plan is and what you all are expecting. So the next section is the local data. So the local data is where the community colleges and tribal colleges are going to update their information. The information is the same as it was in the previous slide. It's your expended amount. How much money have you paid out? The current balance is going to automatically be calculated. And then, of course, your project phase, or project status, I'm sorry, your project phase, and then the goal and the milestone achieved last quarter. So keep in mind, on the project phase, this is a drop-down menu, and you do have several options. You have the option of, project is in design, project is in planning, project is in construction. Purchasing in progress, so there's different options that you can choose from in here. And then you'll notice also your goals and milestones for last quarter and next quarter. Same thing. You want to put as much information as you can in here each month, so that way it is possible for DFA, LFC, the legislature, whenever they pull these reports, that they can actually see the status of a project. One of the other important points that I want to make here to all institutions is, even if you are not actively in construction, you still need to make comments, because no comment hurts you in the end, because if there's no movement on the funding and there's no comment to support why, then the legislature or the executive can look at that project as a stalled project. And then that's when you'll start having individuals like Stevie Olson with LFC contacting, or Wesley or myself contacting about what's going on with this particular project, So in order to minimize all of that, it's important that you go ahead and add comments, explaining, even if you're not, like I say, in active construction, add comments explaining what's going on. And we have had several examples. I've had several conversations with several institutions about doing this because it is important. It is important for us to know, and this is the only way that we know, by looking at this system. So then as you go down, you're going to see the last submission date and the last update. So the last submission date, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Wesley, because I always get confused, but the last submission date is automatically populated by the system, but no, I'm sorry. The last update is automatically populated by the system, but the last submission date is something that you have to populate yourself as an institution. It's important that you do that as well, because that's the date that we all look at to show when you last updated the document or last updated the system. And since it is required that it be updated on a monthly basis for those that are issued a grant agreement, this is the date that we use in order to determine whether or not you have in fact provided updates. If you don't, even though you populated all these updates, we won't know that they're updates unless you populate that area. So now we'll move on to the project timeline. This is also extremely important, and this is probably one of the areas that is the least used, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk a little bit more about it and highlight it. All you're doing here is populating the timeline. You notice that there's a date completed, expected completion date, or not applicable at the top. And then you'll notice in your columns, and then amount funded to date, future funding amounts, funding source, all that good stuff. And then on your rows, you'll notice grant agreement issued, water rights, easement of right of way, all that stuff. So on your grant agreement issued, you want to just enter the date that the grant agreement was issued. Just enter the date there. The amount funded to date, you don't have to enter that amount into the you don't have to enter any amounts into the grant agreement issued, because you will populate that further on down the line. But as you go down, you'll notice on this particular example, the design, that particular contract was executed for the design on May 31st of 2018, and there was $182,962 funded to date for that. The funding source was general obligation bond. The contractor was FBT Architects. The contract amount is the $182,962. And then the comments, you can put the purchase order number, or you can put the phase, which is already in that particular row, but I mean, it was added here as well. And then the next one, construction, same thing, you go across the line. The contract amount and the funded to date amount don't have to necessarily match up. And the reason why I say that is because you may have $1,750,925 funded to date in the GOB, but the contract amount may be, $2.6 million because you're using internal funds. If you want to be able to break that out, you can do it one of two ways. You can go ahead and add the full amount funded to date to match the contract amount, if that's the case. And in your funding sources, put GOB and then / or dash, the other funding source. And then you can also clarify that in the comments. But again, it is important to fill out the project timeline. And so, planning can also be populated in here. If you're doing an acquisition, that can be populated in here with that funding. But I just wanted to make that point. Uh-oh. I lost my slide deck. Bear with me here. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know what happened here. Let me see. Okay, there we go. So what I was going to say is so that pretty much concludes that section on the grant agreements, the notice of obligations, and and the reporting. So I'll go ahead and pause now for questions. Let me see. Let me look in the chat here. So there's a question here of, aren't local entities required to submit quarterly goals as well as our monthly updates? And so the answer to that is no. The quarterly updates and the quarterly updates that you provide, the monthly updates that you provide are the updates and goals that the higher education department will provide in our quarterly update. What's also important to note is that the entity updates also are captured. So for instance, if I do my quarterly update and there's something that I did not capture, the local entity update is still captured. It's just for reporting purposes that that we do state agencies on a quarterly basis and local entities on a monthly basis. What are the quarters or the state? So the quarters are March 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and December 15th. And those are the quarterly updates for universities, four-year institutions, and state agencies, the higher education department. Again, if you receive a grant agreement, you are still required to report on a monthly basis. There is a question, if a university is tribal, do they fall into local or state? And so we do have tribal universities. However, those tribal universities are not constitutionally created. And for that reason, their appropriations are provided through an oversight agency, which is the higher education department. Now, for that reason, they are required to report on a monthly basis. So I guess the easiest way to look at this is, if you receive a grant agreement for your appropriations, you report on a monthly basis. If you don't, you report on a quarterly basis. Hope that clears it up. I don't see any other questions. Let me just make sure. Nope, there's no other questions. So now we'll go ahead and move on to draw requests, which is block 4. So as we're discussing draw requests, one of the important things that I want to bring up is that this presentation was established in a way that hopefully, allows you to see the progression of how things materialize, with an appropriation, right? We talk about, the grant agreement process. We talk about the notice of obligation process. And once those two items are addressed, and you are now able to start expending funds, then you move into the draw request process. And So of course, for draw requests, I have to make the statement again, which is, for constitutional schools, for those 4-year institutions that are established under the Constitution, the bond funding is provided to them directly. For those institutions that are issued a grant agreement, those funds are provided to the higher education department. And that's really what this particular section addresses, which is how do you get your money, right? And so there are 2 types of draw requests, as I mentioned, and that's what we're talking about, which is appropriations made to the higher education department and then direct appropriations to the institutions. So for those so the first thing we're going to talk about is appropriations made to the higher education department. So this is what we want to talk about here is the NMHED draw request procedures, and then of course back to the grant agreement. So if you get a grant agreement, then you know that you have to request draws from the higher education department. So this is the higher education department's draw request procedures. This was updated in January of this year. We've had these procedures out for a while, but they were updated this year. And one of the things that that we wanted to make sure and update is the specific discussion on the need for the grant agreement to be in place, which is the first section, and executed. The need to have an active notice of obligation in place, before you can actually, number 1, spend any money, and then of course, number 2, before you can draw down any money. And then we did want to make note of an exception to this rule, right? And that exception is academic library expenditures. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other item that we talked about is the specific requirements of what needs to be submitted whenever you send in a draw request. And that's really what section 3 is in the procedures. Right, and it's original completed and signed draw request form and certification, copy of general ledger check detail and or program detail report, a copy of an itemized list of all expenditures which tie to each invoice, and a receipt to include date, amount, vendor name, voucher or check number, invoice number, and then of course the total of all the amounts being requested. And of course, this total amount has to equal the total amount of the draw request. And then copies of the invoices and receipts that show the item being purchased, the date purchased or invoiced, and the amount. And then of course, proof of payment. It's important that we receive proof of payment because bond funds are reimbursements. So they are not, they are not provided prior to. They are reimbursable, and so we do need to see the proof of payment. And then, of course, we added this section, which I was talking about earlier, which is the print screen from CPMS, verifying the monthly update. The procedure also makes a couple of other notes in here that are important, and that is that we make draw requests. As you make a draw request to us, we in turn also, as a state agency for bond funding, must make a request to the State Board of Finance. And so the State Board of Finance deadlines for submittal of a draw are by 3 p.m. on the 1st and the 15th of each month, or by 9 a.m. the next business day, if the 1st or 15th falls on a weekend or holiday. And the minimum draw request amount is $1,500. unless it is the final draw request or it's the end of the fiscal year. And so I want to make that known, because when you submit your draw requests to us, if we receive those draw requests 1 or 2 days from the date that we have to submit it to the Board of Finance, we may or may not be able to get those draws processed in time. And so what that means is you may have to wait for another 15 days before we even submit it to the Board of Finance. And of course, once the Board of Finance receives it, they have a process that they go through before they transfer the money to the agency. And then once we receive the money at the agency level, then we can pay it out in our system. So the time frame between when you submit a draw to the time that you receive the funds can vary. And that's why I bring up this point and why we added it to the procedure. And then, of course, you want to submit all your draw requests and required supporting documentation to myself and to Loretta, with a copy to Loretta via email. And the original completed and signed draw request form and certification must be mailed to the offices in Santa Fe, to the NMHED offices in Santa Fe. So the reason why we made this change is due to COVID, due to the fact that our offices have been closed due to the public health orders and the need to, to remain, socially distanced. And so, so right now our draw request procedures do allow for submittal of all the documentation via email. But again, we still require the signed draw request form and certification to be mailed to the offices in Santa Fe. The next item that I want to talk about is just the grant agreement. And again, I'm just trying to tie these in together so that way everybody can see, where these requirements come from. So in the grant agreement, it speaks to the grantee submitting a request for payment, right? And it also speaks to the request for payment containing proof of payment by the grantee or liabilities incurred by the grantee, showing that the expenditures are valid or are liabilities incurred by the grantee in the form of actual unpaid invoices received by the grantee for services rendered by a third party. It also talks about where a grantee is submitting a request for payment based upon invoices received but not yet paid. And what it talks about there is that, we can accept that, but the only time that we will accept those kinds of changes or those kinds of submittals is, again, based on our procedure, if it is towards the end of the fiscal year, where you may receive the invoices, but you don't have time to pay them to get them submitted to us by the deadline. And if that's the case, then we do allow you to submit unpaid invoices, but just with that, just in that particular instance. And then also it talks a little bit about the grantee obligating 5% within 6 months and expending no less than 85% 6 months prior to the reversion date. And so, so this is part of what we're talking about before, what Ashley was talking about before, which is the tax liabilities and the tax requirements, when it comes to non-taxable bonds. And so, so again, this is the information that is noted on the grant agreement. And then the last section that I want to talk about on the grant agreement is the deadlines. And so on the deadlines, the grant agreement speaks to the grantee, which is all of the HEIs, submitting their request immediately as they are received, but a minimum of 30 days from when the expenditure was incurred. July 15th of each year for all unreimbursed expenditures incurring during the previous fiscal year, or 20 days from the early termination, or 20 days from the reversion date. So in essence, this gives the guide, of when we as an agency can accept and reimburse these drawdown requests. And so like I say, I mean, it's really something that we're that we have been very happy with on how institutions have been submitting their draw requests. So I want to thank everybody for all of the work that they've done, in meeting all of these requirements, for submittal of draws, submittal of notice of obligations, and working closely with the higher education department, because it is commendable that we are able to manage all of this funding, and do it as called out for in the grant agreement. The next item that I wanted to kind of just go over real quickly is just the draw request form. I think that everybody is familiar with the draw request form. I really just wanted to pull it up real quick here, so that way everybody could see, what it is that the draw request form looks like. This is the form. This is the only form, should I say, that we are requiring be submitted in hard copy and wet ink signatures to the department, when you submit a draw request. This form, along with all the supporting documentation for a draw, can be emailed to us. But this section, so you'll see up top, the date. That's the date when you're creating it. The from section is the name of the institution. If it's San Juan College, if it's Central New Mexico Community College, if it's University of New Mexico Taos branch, make sure that you enter in this section University of New Mexico Taos. Or if it's New Mexico State University Doña Ana. Make sure that you enter the branch campus as on this draw form. The draw request number, that's self-explanatory. The type of bonds, project title, DFA project number, we'll go through that on the next slide. The original appropriation, AIPP amount, and total amount available after AIPP. We'll talk about that on the next slide as well. Less amount of this draw request, that's just the amount that this particular draw request is for. Less pending draw requests, those are the draw requests that you have not received payment on, that you have previously submitted. And then less approved draw requests, those are the ones that you have in fact received the funding for. And then the total amount for draws to date is just, of course, adding, the previous three areas together. I mean, that gives you your total amount for draws to date. And then the available balance is really just taking your total amount available after AIPP and subtracting your total amount for draws to date. And that, of course, will give you your available balance. So as you go down for the wire transfer information, for the institution in this section, you don't have to put the branch campus. If the funding is going into a collection account at the main campus, all you need to do is put the main campus name here. But otherwise, you'll just put the name of the institution. The amount due should match the less amount of this draw request above. And then the institution's account number, receiving bank location, and bank transit number information is populated. And then, of course, you know, the name and the title of the individual who is authorized to sign on draw requests. And then, of course, their signature. And then, of course, the higher education department fills out the NMHD approval piece on the bottom. And then as we go to the certification next on the next page, you know, this really is the individual authorized to certify this draw request and the documentation that is submitted in regards to the draw requests or to support it. And then, of course, this needs to be notarized. So that's a quick overview of the draw request and certification page. As we go to the next page, here is an example of where you find all of the information to populate the top of the draw request. You'll find it in CPMS, and you'll find it under your particular appropriation ID number. So for instance, I'm going to use this as the example. So if you look at on the left, the type of bonds, if you look at CPMS, the type of bonds can be found under the fund code. So you would put general obligation bonds or GOB in that section of the form. Under project title, if you go to CPMS, you're going to see the appropriation title. The appropriation title for this one is Navajo Tech University Learning Innovation Center. You would take that title and plug it into the project title area of the draw request form. The DFA project number, you take that from the appropriation ID number of CPMS, and you'll see that that's referenced there. The institution project number, this is your specific number as an institution that you use. It'll make it easier for you to track what this draw request is for in the finance department. So a lot of institutions use this. Some of you don't. It is optional. We don't have any reference to use here. It's all internal for you all. The chapters and laws, you'll notice on CPMS, there's a chapter section, 8210C2 for this particular appropriation. That's what you're going to enter here. You're going to enter chapter 82, section 10C2. And then for laws are going to be the year. And I don't have an arrow to that, and I'm not sure why. But if you look at on the CPMS side, at the top of the sheet, you're going to see year 2016. That's the laws. So it's laws of 2016. So when you do the chapter in laws, you'll do chapter 82, section 10C2, laws of 2016 for this particular example. And then for reversion date, you'll just pull it, same thing, right off of CPMS, June 30th, 2021 for this particular example. As you go down to the budget summary section of the form, the original amount of appropriation, you find this in CPMS as well. That's the state amount of $850,000. The AIPP amount, if there is any, you'll find that under the AIPP amount for Board of Finance, which you'll see there is the 1%, $8,500. And then the total amount available after AIPP, as I mentioned, is really your appropriation amount, your original appropriation amount minus your AIPP amount. I mean, it's that simple. That's what that section is. So I hope that's helpful because it gives a reference of where you can pull all that top information, and it gives you a reference of where we look when we're verifying these draw requests as well. So The next item that I want to kind of just quickly talk about is academic library appropriations. And the reason why I bring this up is because during this entire presentation, I really did make a separation between constitutionally established institutions versus tribal colleges and community colleges in the state, and how the grant agreement process and how the draw request process and the notice of obligation process doesn't apply to the constitutionally created institutions. Well, there is one exception to that, and that's academic library appropriations. And the reason why academic library appropriations are handled through a grant agreement is because the funding is not given to any specific institution. The funding as a whole is provided and appropriated to the higher education department. The higher education department then relies on the New Mexico Consortium of Academic Libraries to calculate the distribution amount for the statewide collaborative project, which is the collaborative project amongst all academic libraries in the state, and then using the most current enrollment data for the fall that the higher education department has and posts on our website. Using that data, they then do the distribution of funds to all of the higher education institutions. That distribution is then verified by the higher education department, and in turn, that's what generates grant agreements to all higher education institutions for their piece of the library appropriation, of the academic library appropriation. Those grant agreements automatically trigger certain requirements, such as the notice of obligation requirement and the CPMS reporting requirement. It's important to note that there is not a need for an institution to request a notice of obligation for academic library appropriations. And there is not a need for CPMS reporting by any higher ed institution for academic library appropriation. And the reason for this is because academic library appropriations, although they are GO bond appropriations, are set aside for a different type of expenditure. And because that funding is appropriated to the higher education department, we do the reporting for all of the expenditures and for all of the for the institutions in one update to CPMS. As I was saying earlier, academic library appropriations are for different types of expenditures. This is the approved New Mexico Consortium of Academic Libraries, or NMHED, guidelines for expenditures of library GO bond funds. So you'll notice on these, as you're looking at this particular guideline, there are 4 buckets that this funding can be used for. Books, journals, databases, microforms, media, DVDs, CDs, films, maps, models, kits, art collections. In the equipment bucket, scanners, printers, and I'm not going to go through each one, but just to give you an idea. Under electronic resources, OCLC, Amigos, Iliad, WorldShare, and then EBSCO. And then technology projects, you have your electronic pathfinders like LibGuides, software for digital repositories, and so on and so forth. So this is a guide for academic libraries to follow. when making purchases. You know, it's important to note that this appropriation, this general bond obligation bond appropriation, is you know, cannot be expended for supplies. You know, such as tattle tape, paper, toner cartridges, those types of things. You know, and really the focus should be on improving library services, you know, for its patrons, right? And lastly, you know, it really is to supplement, you know, your existing library budgets, you know, not replace them. And so, so again, I wanted to just bring this up because I think that a lot of institutions sometimes are concentrating very heavily on the capital outlay appropriations, you know, and sometimes the academic library appropriation slips through the cracks. Specifically, the requirements that it does need a grant agreement, and before you can draw down the funding, you know, you have to request a drawdown from the higher education department. And so I wanted to just touch on that real quickly. So that way individuals could, you know, could see this. And the last thing is, if you do have an appropriation, or should I say an expenditure that you are planning on purchasing towards the GO bond for libraries, and you are unsure if it fits into one of these buckets, send me an email. You know, send me an email and ask me. Since we don't issue notice of obligations, you know, sometimes it's, you know, it's easier to just send an email and ask me before making the purchase and then finding out that it's not allowed. So the last thing that I want to kind of talk about with libraries is, because this is the second sheet of the guide, is the GO bond language, right? And the GO bond language specifically states that this appropriation is for, you know, equipment, electronic resources, collaborative library resources, and technology projects. And so this is kind of a definition of what those are in, you know, in the GO bond language. So now that we've covered this section, you know, I want to talk a little bit about research and comprehensives, because I've talked a lot about what institution, what community colleges and what tribal institutions need to do in order to submit a draw, but we haven't really talked about what you know, research and comprehensives need to do to submit a draw. You know, how you submit the draw and what's needed as part of that draw. So this is a good opportunity now for me to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Nick Gonzalez with the State Board of Finance, because the State Board of Finance is the oversight entity for these types of draw requests. So Nick, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Gerald. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can see you and hear you. Yes, sir.
Okay, sounds good. I'm Nick Gonzalez. I'm the new financial coordinator with the Board of Finance. I started with Board of Finance in January. I deal with all the draw requests from all the state agencies and higher educational institutes. Just thank you, Gerald, for allowing me to take part in this presentation. Wesley, I also want to apologize. I was no help on that equipment under 10,000. I'll follow up with Director Leach on that question. Okay, so if we could get started with the Board of Finance draw process. As Gerald would said, we receive draws on the 1st and 15th of each month. To start out, I organize all the draws file, give them document numbers, invoice numbers, and then we have a lot of manual entering, so I have to enter all the Board of Finance requests into the database, and we print all the backups. So I don't know if Hi, Gerald, can you help me with this? If higher educational institutes have access to share, so if they're able to see the backup we create for their payment vouchers?
So no, Nick, none of the higher education department, none of the higher education institutions utilize the share financial system. So the only documentation that they receive is documentation that is submitted from our agency verifying payment.
Okay. So yeah, we have to create all the backup documentation for, I guess, our financials. Once that's done, we have to enter it into our database. And after we enter it into our database, that's when we can see what's remaining balance for each project. And in the next slide, I'll show you what we're looking for on the draw request. Once information is entered into our database, then we have to go in and actually enter it into our share financials, and that's where the payment vouchers are developed. And then the payment vouchers go through multiple levels of finance through DFA for approval before you guys receive the check or ACH, the wire transfer. Joe, if you could go to the next slide, please. So for Board of Finance, these are the following items I'm looking for. Please take into account I'm dealing with multiple draws on the 1st and 15th from multiple state agencies, multiple higher education institutes. So what I'm looking for is the correct appropriation stated at the top right corner, the correct bond series filled out. As Gerald was saying, you can find the bond series in CPMS. Correct title to the appropriation, draw request amount stated. We need the authorizing signature and also the notary signature with the stamp, HED approval, and then State Board of Finance actions if applicable. So on the next slide, if you could go back one, Gerald, you can see the required fields on the draw request. They're on the top right. I would say that's the most important one I'm looking at because that will be what I'm looking to tie into our database, State Board of Finance project number. If that's stated incorrectly, then the draw request is going to hit the incorrect project. Then you have bond series, project title, the amount stated, authorized signature, notary signature, and we look for the stamp. And now, I think it got cleared in December. Every draw request needs to be notarized. Go to the next slide, please. So this is just the required backup documentation. As you can see in the first document, HED review is not required. So we're not looking for that HED approval form. And the next one, HED, is that one the one that's, okay, so there's State Board of Finance that does need approval. And then we're also looking for the State Board of Finance actions. I think, sorry, Gerald, I skipped the slide, moved on to the next. So those are the main forms we're looking for the backup of the draws. Just make sure everything's stated on the draw request and that we do have higher educational approval. And if it did go to the State Board of Finance, we need the action showing that is approved. If we could go on to the next slide, Gerald, we're going to go over just the disbursement rule. So this is the actual disbursement rule. Right now, since everything's electronically, it might be different. We don't require 2 copies, as you can see in bullet point A. We just request 1 copy that's notarized. Proof of payment, evidence of conditions. I'm going to follow back up with bullet point C, conditions. But as you can see in bullet point E, it's the things I stated. If the capital project only requires higher education approval, higher education department approval letter, the project requires higher educational approval and Board of Finance, we need the action sheet as well. And then if the calc project does not require higher education department approval, that's that first form we saw where it's just that it was stated and signed by higher education that it does not need their approval. So following back up with bullet point C, evidence of conditions. Gerald, if you want to step in on this one, I've seen other state agencies that have had conditions, and I don't know if HED or financial institutions also have conditions that were set, but these usually come through when we're doing questionnaire review.
Thank you, Nick. So for everybody that's on the presentation now, I spoke to that a little bit earlier in the grant agreement process, where there is an opportunity offered in the grant agreement in order for additional conditions to be added to a project. Right now, I will say that the higher education institutions, have been doing an amazing job at utilizing their funding, drawing down their funding, and being in compliance with, with the requirements of the bond proceeds. And so we have not had an instance where we have had to, should I say, issue a conditions memo or a release of conditions. However, should that happen, yes, that is something that we would do. But it's good that you make note of this, Nick, for even for my information as well, and then for the institutions as well. So thank you.
Yes, so on the State Board of Finance, we're unable to disperse any funds. Say a conditions memo was sent out, and these happen after questionnaire review, and the board and bond council, they find an issue if we need some sort of agreement or some sort of certification. So we won't disperse any funds until we receive an executed agreement or that certification. I also wanted to follow up with Gerald's comment on the 1,500 threshold. So we will process a draw request under the 1,500 threshold, but we like good reason. So like, say you've had that project and you've had that draw just sitting on the table waiting for another payment to hit that project to go over that threshold, but you need to balance your financials for that month or balance them in general. We just need an email or anything asking that we go ahead and process that draw request. Also, some projects, for example, the public education department, they get obligated small amounts of money. So when they do submit draw requests, they are for small amounts, but they ask that due to the fact that the overall obligated amount was small from the beginning. So we will process those draw requests, but we do ask for documentation and reason why. Because the last thing, we have multiple draw requests on the 1st and 15th of every month, and the volume is really high, so to be doing draw requests for less than that can add up. Gerald, if you want to go to the next slide for end of year timeline. These are just dates Board of Finance would like to make the higher educational institutes aware. We have the drawdown reimbursement request. The final deadline is July 16th by 5 o'clock. And then for the reversions, deadline is September 6th. And that's all I have, Gerald. So if anyone has any questions.
Thank you, Nick. Again, I really appreciate you guys taking the time to to do the presentation today. I think it's important for all of the institutions to have an opportunity to be able to meet Nick, since he is new to the position, and and I know that having worked with him over the past month, couple of months, should I say, we've had several discussions about draws, and so I was glad that they were able to, or that he was able to come and do a presentation for us as well. So, are there any questions that anybody has? I'll look in the chat. So there is a question of is there can you give us an example of dates when is the best time and date to send in a draw request to give sufficient time for the higher education department to submit to the State Board of Finance? You know, if I can receive draw requests at least 5 days prior to the 1st and 15th, then that gives me sufficient time in order to review them. Unlike Nick, I only have the higher education draw requests, so we can process anywhere from 8 to 10 draw requests per deadline. Where Nick, on the other hand, I think probably processes over 100 per deadline. Maybe even more than that. So like I say, if I can get them at least 5 days before, it gives me an opportunity to review, and then also it gives me an opportunity to ask any questions or get clarifications from an institution if need be. Are there any other questions that anybody has for Nick or for myself? All righty, well, thank you, Nick. I appreciate it. So the last thing, the last thing that I want to do is just let everybody know that all of the information that was covered today, including the PowerPoints, are going to be made available on the NMHED website. And on the screen here, you'll see that all of the draw request information that we went over, including the grant agreement, including the notice of obligation procedures, the draw request procedures, and the forms, can all be found at the link that I have here on the screen. And then the training and the presentations will also be made available. The PowerPoints will be made available here shortly after this meeting is done. And then, as I mentioned, the recording itself will be made available after tomorrow, but I will send an email to everybody letting you know. But the last thing that I wanted to just put on the screen here as well is just contact information for me and of course for Loretta. But I truly do appreciate everybody taking their time to come out today and spend a few hours with us this morning. We will be having another training. I don't have the dates set up for that training yet, but we will be having another training as part of the Higher Education Department Capital training series coming up within the next couple of months. That training is going to be on the energy and climate, where we will be talking about the new executive order and the higher education department's review of that executive order and what the expectations are as a state when it comes to capital outlay and capital outlay projects. And then of course the other training that we will be having as well is will be on a training on capital project approvals, monthly approvals. So those are the trainings to look out for. But again, I just want to thank everybody for your time, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out. Always enjoy having those conversations and assisting where I can. So with that said, I'll look and see if there's any questions or any last minute questions anybody may have. And if not, we'll go ahead and close up. Let's see here. So there is a question on Do we need to mail in a physical copy of the draw request forms? And so the answer is yes. We do need a physical copy, hard copy, wet signature of the draw request and certification form only. All the backup documentation is submitted via email, but we do need the notarized draw request form and certification. So that was the last question that I saw. So again, thank you everybody for your time, and you all have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye, everybody.